Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions that you probably haven't been specifically trained in because you don't do direct patient care, right?
Right.
Okay. So this is more just for me and people watching, to get an idea of, what your personal beliefs and values are.
Okay.
No pressure. So, what is your objective, not subjective, but objective definition of life?
Just living, your heart's beating and you're breathing.
Yeah. And that's the exact
Yeah.
medical definition of life as well, cardiorespiratory function. Okay. So, how do you personally define human life?
How do I guess I go back to like the human experience and what we can do with our lives. That's
Sure.
what I think about. Walking, talking, how do you interact with your world, music, TV. I guess it would be different for every individual.
Yeah. Yeah, and the concept we're talking about here is defined as quality of life. So each person individually defines their own quality of life. And then based on those definitions, they can make decisions with things like advanced directives to either preserve their ability to maintain that quality of life, or to preserve their choice to deny intervention when that quality of life is no longer an option for them. So, to you, what is a quality of life?
I think my standard of life is pretty good at my age, so for me, quality of life is being able to walk, drive, talk, do things independently.
Sure. And what kind of limitations, if there was something to happen to you, what kind of limitations on those quality are on your lifestyle
Would I be okay with?
Uh-huh.
Maybe
Not okay with, but would you want to survive with, or you'd want to live with?
I don't think I would want a tube down my throat for the rest of my life.
Sure.
I think being in a wheelchair would be okay if I could still get around to some extent.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of like tools available now for people that have been engineered to do things, to talk.
Yeah. Yeah, and interestingly, studies I've seen that measure, happiness or adaptivity of people with, say, like amputations, show that within a specified amount of time, usually about a year or so, the adaptations are such that the person expresses, the same general level of happiness that they had pre-amputation. So, yeah, well, I think with most people's definition, there's always a degree of functionality defined in what they consider their own quality of life. So, what's the rationale underlining these considerations for you?
For me, at my point in life, I would say that like the people in my life would be important as far as so for my daughter, like I at least if I was bound to a wheelchair and I to some extent I could at least take part in her life or watch her grow up and kind of give her like instill in her my values and be involved to some extent. And I think that people's decisions about those things are they take into factor the people around them or their family.
Yeah, absolutely. So you might not know these answers directly, but what allows patients to make healthcare decisions?
Well, if they can vocalize, they should. Typically, I'm sure they need to be educated by the healthcare provider to help them make the decision. And if they can vocalize it themselves, then I would hope that they can make their own decision. But then after that, I'm sure it's left to their family members and if they have written an advance directive or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so as direct providers, we do a basic assessment to determine your orientation to your surroundings and the situation you're in. And that's what allows us to consider you apt to consent. And the thing we're talking about with consent is she brought up a really excellent point. Part of consent involves education, mandatory education. So the document you sign when you're given a consent form has risks and benefits to the procedure being done. And the importance of that consent is because we have those consents for different procedures where there is a high degree of risk of permanent life injury or even death in most cases. So we do consents for blood, right?
Mm-hmm.
You verify consents for blood all the time, I imagine.
We don't need a copy of the consent anymore for blood.
Okay.
And I don't go into Power Chart and verify it.
Okay. So that's we're required to do that as nurses. We verify consents, and then usually healthcare providers do too, like your physicians. When you're having a surgery, we'll require you to sign an informed consent. And a really important aspect of the consent process, at least from my end, is I found a lot of people have questions when it comes to the point of signing a consent, which is interesting. A physician has come in already and usually explained the procedure to you, why he wants to do it and why you need it. And then for some reason, as soon as we ask them if they have questions as nurses, they do have quite a few, which vexes a lot of physicians because as nurses, we're not allowed to actually give education on the procedure. We can give, it's a very strange gray area. So we can give some basic education on what the procedure entails. We can't give factors that would be worrisome. We can't give prognosis. We can't give...
Is it a liability?
I don't know exactly what the reason is. I'd suppose the rationale is because we can't diagnose illness or give prognosis. Mm-hmm. So we can't say you have a very good chance of surviving this, because physicians are trained specifically to have that prognosis education. So it's really good when you're signing your consent form, to get a blood transfusion or to have your surgery, when the physician is talking to you about the procedure, to ask all of the questions you can. And also, if you do have questions afterwards, just understand that, that physician, you might have to wait a while for that physician to come back and then give you, more answers and more specificity for the procedure. So, to you, what is the ethical importance of carrying out a patient's healthcare wishes?
I think ethically you should be doing what the patient wants, regardless of family members' emotions. Yeah. Because if they don't want to be left on a feeding tube or alive via machines for a month, then that should be taken, like their wishes should be taken out, or and it shouldn't be left to a family member to alter those.
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is advanced medical directives. And the advanced medical directive is set up kind of like a flow chart where you'll say, I want or I do not want cardiorespiratory resuscitation. I want or I do not want long-term forced air ventilation. I want or I do not want feedings through a tube, either placed, percutaneously into your gut or through a nostril temporarily down into your gut. And there's space under all of these considerations for you to write in your own limitations or your own expectations of how these things would be carried out. But what a lot of people don't know, and I think you just learned this today, right, is that an advanced directive can be overridden. Yeah, absolutely. So the advanced directive you fill out saying, hey, I don't want a tracheostomy or forced air ventilation. If you're unable to make your own healthcare decisions, your family member can say, no, place the tracheostomy anyway. And this happens a lot. I don't know if there's any kind of statistics on it, there probably isn't, but it happens quite a bit. And it's kind of disturbing to us as healthcare providers because we're trained in patient advocacy. And that the basis of patient advocacy says that we need to do everything in our power to advocate for our patient to ensure they get the best care possible and that they get the care that they want. So as long as it's not harmful to them. So if a Jehovah's Witness does not want blood, We don't give blood.
Mm-hmm.
And we do everything else in our power otherwise that would match their personal religious beliefs to try to keep them alive. Well, that's an absolute right they have. So, I mean, yeah, even in a situation where, say, a Jehovah's Witness expresses that they don't want blood to us, and say they become incapacitated for some reason, and they've got a family member who is the next of kin, that's usually based on spouse first, adult children second, if you have adult children, then parents, and then brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, and if there's nobody, then if we have to, we can go to neighbors and friends, those kinds of people. So if that Jehovah's Witness has a next of kin, like a spouse, who says give them the blood anyway, she's signing the consent for us to give the blood, and now we come into a very strange ethical dilemma where, as providers trained to advocate directly for the patient, we're forced to do things that we know full well the patient wouldn't want.
Right.
So there's an interesting way around this. It's very simple and cheap as well. It costs nothing, actually, and that's to fill out a medical power of attorney.
Mm-hmm.
So with a medical power of attorney, you can grant an individual of your choosing the right to make medical decisions on your behalf. It's that simple. So you can choose a person that you know will carry out your wishes, or you can educate that person on what your wishes are and seek assuredness that they will carry out your wishes. And it can literally be anybody.
So you could potentially pick one that knew stuff as far as healthcare wise,
Yeah.
and wasn't emotionally attached to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so if you know a nurse by chance,
Yeah.
or if you have a friend who's a physician, or even just, say one of your fellow lab techs or somebody that has exposure to healthcare, that understands how things work or has contacts with those mediums, you could ask them to be your medical power of attorney. They could file that documentation, and all we need in the hospital is, when that document exists, is we just need the document to be brought into us. And as soon as we have that document on file, that person is now the primary consenter on your behalf.
That sounds like the best route.
Yeah, and you cannot override, a medical power of attorney, but before decisions are made, at least. I imagine there might be cases where people have gone to court over them. I don't know. I'm just suppositing.
That process probably.
It would take a very long time. So decisions could be made in the meantime that are necessary, in the immediacy, to make sure that your wishes are carried out. And I don't think there'd be much of a legal grounds either to say, other than one argument I can't think of is maybe the person wasn't in the right state of mind at the time of granting this medical power of attorney. That would require a lot of evidence, though. And most of the time when those documents are filled out, we're ensuring that you're in the right state of mind to sign that kind of documentation. So